Hello, my name is Fionnuala and I'm a storyteller. I live in a town at the opening of the Mourns. Today's story is about a Shearsmith, it's called, where they share the blacksmith's fire. And it was collected by Jeremiah Curtin in 1944. It's a gory story, so some people might find it too gory, but I can assure you that it is a story and nobody was murdered, okay? So, once upon a time, in a village, I don't know where, because Jeremiah didn't say, except that it was in Ireland, lived a blacksmith called Aloysius. And Aloysius was an unusual blacksmith. He could make bits for plows, he could make gates, but he'd never learned how to make horseshoes. And you can imagine that's a pretty big handicap for a blacksmith, not to be able to make horseshoes. So one day he was in his forge and he was working away when a lovely white carriage comes into the forge. And a wee man jumps out and he had a little red jacket and white breeches and a wee black hat. And he said to Aloysius, "Can I borrow your fire? My horse needs a shoe and I'll do it in minutes. I won't take it for long." And Aloysius said, "Go ahead." And he was thinking, quite excited, I'm going to learn how to make horseshoes. So he watches. And the wee man takes the horse off the carriage, turns the horse upside down, takes the legs off from the knees, goes along and starts to beat and beat and beat and make the horseshoe. Then he turns around, he hammers him back onto the horse's legs, puts the horse's legs back on from the knee down, turns the horse, flip it over and onto the carriage. He thanks Aloysius and says, "Thanks so much for giving me your fire." And off he goes. Aloysius goes home to the wife that evening. Now, they had no children and they lived in a cottage, but they, unfortunately for them, had two very, unhappy stepmothers living with them. So I wouldn't say it was the happiest of houses. So anyway, when they're doing the dishes, he's telling the wife all about the horseshoe. And they're looking out the window and the wife says, "You know, our horse could do with a shoe. Why don't you take it tomorrow and fix it? Make it a shoe." So the next morning he takes the horse in and he stokes up the fire and gets the bellows going, has the tools all ready. And he turns around to turn the horse over. But you know, it was actually really hard to turn the horse over. And he pulled and he hauled and my God, the sweat was lashing off him by the time he got the horse turned over. And then he went to take the legs off from the knees, like the wee man had shown him, but the legs didn't come off and he had to get a saw and he had to saw them off and there was blood everywhere. Anyway, he puts the legs upside down and he starts to make the shoes. And the shoes actually weren't too bad. And then he tries to stick them back on to the horse's feet. And that was okay. And he turns around to put the legs back on the horse, only to find the horse is dead. Well, you'd expect that really, wouldn't you? So he had to go and bury the horse. And then he had to go home and tell the wife what happened. The wife said, "Oh, don't worry, Aloysius. That was a lazy horse anyway. Never did anything. We'll be okay without it." So anyway, life goes on. And about a week later, didn't the wee carriage come back in? And the wee man says, "Aloysius, could I borrow your fire? I need to make something." And Aloysius said, "Of course you can," thinking, what am I going to see today? So he pulls two hags out of the carriage and they were screaming and shouting and yelling. And he gets them onto the fire and he beats and he beats and he beats and he beats and he hammers and he hammers and he hammers. And he pulls out a beautiful young woman. And she gets into the carriage and he says to Aloysius, "Thank you so much, Aloysius, for your fire. I'll be on my way. Thank you." So off he goes. Well, you can imagine Aloysius couldn't wait to go home and tell his wife what he'd seen. And that night after dinner, they were doing the dishes and they were thinking and thinking. And they were looking and looking at the two stepmothers. And they both thought the same thing. They thought that they'd bring them into the forge tomorrow morning and they'd get a young girl out and she would help in the house. And let's face it, that was more than they had now. Because nobody helped. And those two, well, then they're nothing but alone. So the next morning comes along and they dragged those two old women into the forge. They got them onto the forge and they had the fire going really hot and they hammer and hammer and hammer and clatter. And they would go to pull out of the fire. And instead of getting a beautiful young girl out of the fire, they got two very dead stepmummies. And that was really bad. And they felt really bad. They thought, well, we'll get done for this. So they had to bury the two old ladies really fast, clean up, and pretend nothing had happened. So that was okay. They went home, and I guess they might have felt bad about it, but he didn't say, so I don't really know. Well, they didn't have a young girl, but she'd less to do in the house, so she wasn't that unhappy about it. So a few days later, Aloysius discovers that he's nearly out of coal. And in the past, he'd have just got on the horse and gone to the next village to get the coal. But of course, he didn't have a horse anymore. So he had to ask a neighbour to take him. So they headed off to the next town, and they had a good day, They had a few jars and they bought everything they needed. And they were heading home when one of the horses went lame. And the neighbour said, I'm going to have to go into a blacksmith. Would you make the shoes? And Aloysius thinks about it, and he thought, well, those shoes were okay. It wasn't my fault the horse was dead. He says, yeah, I'll make shoes. So they go in to the forge and they ask if they could borrow the fire. And the blacksmith looks at them and said, it's my forge. My apprentice will make the shoe. So they watched, and their apprentice rattled out a lovely shoe in a matter of minutes. And the blacksmith was so proud of himself. And he said, I bet you've never seen a horseshoe made that fast. My apprentice is the fastest one around here. So Aloysius thought about it, and he really should have just said nothing. The way they say nothing. But instead of that, he says, actually, I do know a wee man who can make one quicker than that. I've seen him, and he could get it done dead fast. So the blacksmith decided to have a wager, and whoever won would get £5. So off they go home, and Aloysius realizes that he actually doesn't know where the wee man lives, and he doesn't even know his name. There's no way of contacting him. And he's beginning to think that was a really silly idea, which it was really. So as the days go by, he's getting a bit worried, when one day into the forge comes the wee man. And he says, could I borrow your fire? The spring's gone and I need to fix it. And Aloysius said, yes, no problem. And as the wee man's making and hammering and making the wire, Aloysius tells him about the wager. And the wee man says, so I want to get this straight. You went and you made a wager about me, what I could do, even though you didn't know I was coming back and you didn't know how to contact me. And is that right? And Aloysius said, that's about it. So the wee man said, okay, I'll do it for you, but no more, just once. So they go off anyway, and they have they meet at the blacksmith, and they have a discussion who's going to go first. So the young man goes first, and he makes rabbits, and he makes sheaths of corn, and he makes horseshoes, of course. And then the old man goes and he makes horseshoes, and then he makes dogs to run after the hares, and then he makes a thrasher to take up the corn. And this went on all afternoon until they eventually decided that the old man was quicker and the things he made were better. So they won the money. On the way home, Aloysius was feeling very pleased. And the wee man said, Aloysius, don't do that again. Like, you've no way how to contact me. So that would be silly. But I like you, Aloysius, and I'm going to make you a wealthy man. And Aloysius thinks, well, here, that's great. And he puts the hat on his head. And in good Star Trek fashion, once the hat goes on, they appear outside a castle in England. And the wee man explains to him, this is the King of England in this castle. And he's very, very ill. And nobody can make him better. So Aloysius, you've got a nice suit on now, and I've got my suit on. You're going to go up there and convince them that you're the best doctor in Ireland and that I'm your assistant. And we're going to sort it out. So they go up and they knock on the door of the castle. And when they tell them that they're here to make the king better and they know they can do it and that he's the best doctor in Ireland and he's the best assistant in Ireland, they let them in. And the wee man had said to Aloysius that he must ensure there's nobody else in the room. They all have to clear the room and they want lots of hot water left in the room. So he did that. And believe it or not, people were so desperate to get the king better. They did it. They provided loads of hot water and they left the room. And as soon as they closed the door, Aloysius watched as the wee man gets up on the bed and takes off the king's head, takes the top of the head. And he shakes it about a bit, and then he takes it over and he steeps it in water, and then he brings it back, and he puts it back on top of the king, and then he stitches it all up, puts a bit of hair on it, and Bob's your uncle. The king sits up, completely cured. So the whole palace was in an uproar. They were so glad, so happy, and they gave them loads of money to go home and loads of thanks. So off they go home. And on the way home, the wee man says to Aloysius, now Aloysius, no more wagers. You've got enough money to live on. Just enjoy life. Go and do your bit on the forge if you want to, but don't get into trouble, okay? And, they lived very happily for a couple of years. They had enough money to live on, and it didn't matter if nobody came to the forge, but he went every day, and they built a nicer house, and, they had a girl now to help in the house. So that was all going well when word reached Aloysius that the King of Scotland was dying, and they were looking for the best doctor in Ireland to come and make him better, just like he did with the King of England. Now, Aloysius should have just said nothing and stayed at home, but instead, he just couldn't do that. And he goes off to Scotland and presents himself as the best doctor in Ireland, and he's going to save the king. But he needed everybody out in the room. He needed loads of hot water, and that once they leave him alone with the king, he'll be fine. So they did that because they'd heard about this, that this happened in the King of England. So that's what they did. And they left him alone as the king. He closed the door and locked it. And he gets a hacksaw and he takes the top of the king's head, takes it over and puts it into the basin of hot water, brings it back. The king's dead. He's just like the horse. He's dead as a dodo. And he thinks, oh God, what am I going to do? I won't be able to get out of here. They'll be after me. I'll be murdered. What am I going to do? He's really scared. When there was a big bang and a flash, and who appeared with the wee man? And Aloysius said, I know I shouldn't have done this. No, you shouldn't have done it. You shouldn't have done it. I told you, no more. No more pretending you can do things you can't do. No more horseshoes. Just live a good life. Now, I'm going to help you out, Aloysius. So he got onto the bed and he did a whole lot of stuff at the top of the head. And lo and behold, the king woke up alive and well. They let everybody in. They gave them loads of money. And off Aloysius and the wee man went. On the way home, the wee man said to Aloysius, now, Aloysius, I want you to promise me to keep out of trouble. You're not a doctor. You don't know how to take heads off and put them back on. And you don't know how to shoe a horse properly. So just do what you're doing, be happy, and don't be greedy. And Aloysius took that all on board. He went home to the wife, and they sold up the forge and they sold the house, and they bought a nicer house in a bigger town. And they had a ball. They had parties, they had people in and out, and they just lived a very happy life. They lived happily ever after, in fact. And that is the end of the story.